This is the Sri Ramana Maharshi satsang, a time to listen, reflect, and deeply meditate. Know yourself and be always free and at peace. So, welcome. Let me adjust my screen. And I'm Richard Clarke, hosting this satsang. I love this teaching and want to share it. I'm reviewing and commenting on the book Talks with Ramana Maharshi. This time is talk 99. Let me get it on screen. A sannyasi asked, it is said that the self is beyond the mind, and yet the realization is with the mind. And then he gives a quote from the Kena Upanishad: the mind cannot think it. It cannot be thought of by the mind, and the mind alone can realize it. How are these contradictions to be reconciled, he asks. And Maharshi says, Atman is realized with a dead mind, that is, a mind devoid of thoughts and turned inward. Then the mind sees its own source and becomes that. It is not as the subject perceiving an object. When the room is dark, a lamp is necessary to illumine and eyes to cognize objects. But when the sun is risen, there is no need of a lamp and the objects are seen. And to see the sun, no lamp is necessary. It's enough that you turn your eyes towards the self-luminous sun. Similarly, with the mind, to see the objects, the reflected light of the mind is necessary. To see the heart, it is enough that the mind is turned towards it. Then the mind loses itself and the heart shines forth. Now, Ramana Maharshi explains that the self, though beyond the mind, can be realized with a mind that is devoid of thoughts and turned inward. This fits an ancient Indian yogic idea that you become what you think. You become what you focus your mind upon. When the mind becomes still, it sees its own source and becomes it. It merges with the self and becomes one with it. This is self-realization. This realization is not like an object being perceived by a subject, but rather it is a merging of the subject and object into one. It is more a dissolving than a merging. The mind dissolves into the self. Ramana Maharshi gives the analogy of a dark room where a lamp is needed to see objects and eyes are needed to perceive them. However, when the sun rises, no lamp is needed, and objects are seen directly in the light of the sun. The sun, though, doesn't need any other light other than its own. It is self-luminous. When the mind looks at objects, it needs some external light to illumine the objects. But when the mind looks within, when the mind is turned towards the self is illumined by its own light of knowing. The self knows the self. Then the mind loses its imagined individuality and the self shines forth, just as the sun shines without the need for a lamp. To reconcile the apparent contradiction that the self is beyond the mind and yet realized through the mind, you must understand that the mind must become still and turn inward to know the self. When this happens, it is not that the mind merges with the self, but rather the mind is dissolved by the self. The mind has a job to recognize and differentiate all the separate objects in relation to your separate individual self. But when you know all this as one, there are no more separate objects. And so there's no more job for the mind. This realization is not a mental concept, but a direct experience of the self once the mind has gotten out of the way. So it is like both are true. The mind is an impediment to knowing the self, obscuring it with mental projections and imaginations, and the mind is the doorway to the self, opened only by a quiet mind diving into the self. Ramana Maharshi emphasizes that the self cannot be grasped by the mind or any mental concepts. It is beyond the limitations of the mind and only can be realized through direct experience. That's why he says that, quote, the mind cannot think it, and it cannot be thought of by the mind. Ramana Maharshi says that the realization of the self is not a matter of acquiring something new, but rather it's a matter of removing the obstacles that prevent us from realizing our true natures. These obstacles are the various misidentifications, tendencies, and habits that arise in the mind and create the illusion of individuality and separation. These are examined as you investigate and inquire. The key to realizing the self is to turn the mind inward and abide in the stillness and silence of the heart. This requires sustained practice and effort to overcome the habits of the mind and to cultivate a deep and abiding awareness of the self. This is a matter of direct experience, not cognitive understanding with the mind. To find this experience, Ramana tells us to inquire, practice self-inquiry, asking, who am I? This practice requires turning the attention inward and asking yourself, who am I, in a reflective and contemplative manner. As you ask the questions, various thoughts and mental impressions may arise, which should be observed, examined in a detached and non-judgmental manner. The goal of the practice is to go beyond the surface level identities and roles that we typically identify with, and to arrive at a deeper understanding of our true nature as the self. You do this practice sitting quietly with the eyes closed, and you begin by asking yourself, who am I? Allow the question to sink in and observe any thoughts or mental impressions that arise in response. As thoughts rise, gently bring your attention back to the question, who am I, without getting caught up in the content of the thought. Over time, with consistent practice, the mind will become more still and focused, allowing for deeper insight and realizations. You can also, as thoughts come up, investigate them. See what misidentification they are built on. See what mistaken idea of happiness is within the thought. Thoughts don't just come up. They rise from your tendencies. These can be dissolved by inquiry into the misidentification and examining within yourself the idea of happiness and the source of happiness. This process also leaves your mind more still and focused. It's important to approach your practice with a sense of curiosity and openness without clinging to any particular answer or concept of the self. All of these are just ideas. Rather, the goal is to allow the question to lead you deeper into the awareness and knowledge of the self, and to let go of all mental concepts and limitations that obscure this knowledge. Through consistent practice, the practice of self-inquiry can lead to a profound and transformative realization of the self as you go beyond the limitations of the mind and recognize your true nature as pure consciousness. Now we'll listen to my teacher Nomi with a discourse, Being is Knowing.
In self-knowledge, being is the knowing. As Sri Bhagavan has instructed, in self-knowledge, or self-realization as we call it, there are not two selves, one to know or not know another. Self-knowledge is non-dual, free from the pairs of knower and the thing known. So it is not the relation of knowing, as is found in that which is conceived or perceived. Indeed, what can you perceive of your being? What can the senses tell you about it? Or what can be conceived of being? What thought can there be for the self? Bodiless you are. How could anything pertaining to the body define or confine you? The unknown knower of all that is known, as the Upanishad says, of yourself. What thought, what mode of thinking, what state of mind could possibly pertain to you in your real being? As long as one's true nature is not known, there will be the tendency to conceive of oneself as being in some kind of state, waking, dreaming, deep sleep, embodied state, a disembodied state, life and death. And then hearing of self-realization, there will similarly be the conception that it is a state, something to be attained anew, or an event that is yet to occur. But if there be knowledge of yourself, then the natural state, sahaja, innate state, natural state, is you, is yours. And you are not awake, you are not dreaming, you're not asleep. You're not being born or dying. You are not in an ignorant state. And you're not in an enlightened state. For being is not a state, an event, a thing, an activity. Being, the self, which is Brahman, the vast absolute, is quite transcendent, innately, of all such differentiation. It is in nothing, and nothing is in it. If we conceive of something, it is only in it. But if we do away with imagination by the power of inquiry to know the truth of ourself, then it is in nothing, nothing is in it. It is not doing anything, and nothing occurs to it. Being, the reality of the self, is perpetually silent. It is the unborn, and for the unborn, there is never any creation. For that which is devoid of creation, there is no destruction. Being has no alternative. It is as it is for all eternity, and in this lies the truth of non-duality. One without a second. One without a second. So in this, being is knowing. Make the earnest attempt to know yourself, inquiring, who am I? It does not make a difference what seems to come to your senses or your mind, for whom are these? Seek to know yourself. Who am I? In this way inquire. What happens? We can say the unreal ceases. It ceases because it never came into existence. What is unreal? Every notion from the belief of an existent individual entity or ego down to the belief in a formed, externalized, objective world. So the unreal vanishes. Or we may say, because it's unreal, nothing has vanished. But truth stands shining, self-revealed, in its own light. And in this, being is knowing. We cannot say of the self, I know it, or I do not know it. There is no such entity as I, distinct from the self. How is this truth known? In this, being is knowing. Inquire within yourself. Know yourself by your own light. To attempt to determine your nature by something that is not your nature, well, that will undoubtedly fail. So how would it be possible to know yourself through the thoughts, or through the senses, through things mental or bodily in character? But if inquiring to know who you are deeply, you find that you are bodiless, without a mind, and with nothing to be called I, the undifferentiated, immeasurable existence that remains knows itself. It doesn't just start to know itself. The knowledge is innate and therefore without beginning and end. What then happens in self-realization? We cannot say anything happens. But the very root of all the imagined bondage and ignorance and suffering is vanished. In other words, when bound, we yearn for liberation. When in ignorance, we rightly seek true knowledge. Yet in that true knowledge, we find ignorance never had a basis. Illusion had no start. We were never actually bound. Therefore, rather than think in terms of unrealized and realizing, bondage and liberation, it is better to abide in the steady knowledge of being, as being is. And for that we can say, the real ever is, the unreal has never come to be. The conclusion about this is seen by the knowers of truth.
All right. So let's take a few minutes to inquire, to meditate. Now you exist, and you know that you exist. Now inquire, investigate within yourself. You know the mind, How do you know the mind? Does the mind know itself? Or do you know the mind? From where does the light of knowing come from? Who am I? What is the nature of my existence? What exists? Who am I? All right. And let's close with a chant. Om
Shanti,
Shanti, Shanti,
Shanti,
Shanti.
Shanti.
Om. Peace, peace, peace. Any comments or discussion? Well, I think this is good. When Nomi was happy at satsang, he was just quiet.
Actually, listening to his talks, I can understand why you kept going to him over the years.
Indeed. When I first heard him, it's like I had been reading about this stuff in the form of Chan Buddhism for 25 years, and I never really felt like I understood what I was reading. And from him from the very beginning, then I knew that somehow he was telling me the truth, and a truth that I had wanted to hear and had never heard before. And I didn't really know a lot of what he was saying, but I just kept going. How could you not?
Right.
And finally, listening to him, even though he was coming from a different framework, uh, uh, a year or so later, I ended up rereading a number of my favorite Chan Buddhist things, and for the first time ever, felt like I understood what they were saying. Like one of the things that you hear in the Buddhist world is you hear a lot about attachments and how attachments are a problem. But in 25 years, I never learned what an attachment was. And with Nomi, very quickly, I learned that an attachment is where you project your ego and misidentify yourself, and that is at the basis of the attachment and the suffering that comes from it, because since you have incorrectly identified yourself with whatever it is, how can that ever work out well? When you say to yourself, I'm something that I'm not, then that's not going to work. The other thing that Nomi said that I immediately responded to deeply is the teaching that, whatever this is not something different from who I am. So I don't have to become different. I don't have to transform myself into some other critter to cope with it. What I have to do is actually take the time to get to know what's going on within me.
And that itself is liberating.
Oh, no, indeed. And it seems possible. All this other stuff didn't seem really possible.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, thank you all again for coming together today and sharing our love for Ramana and his teaching. And we'll see you next week. Namaste.
Okay.
Namaste. Thank you so much.
These videos help bring Ramana Maharshi's teachings into your direct experience. Subscribe now to help you deepen your understanding and practice to know the self. Just click the subscribe button.